Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, the novel, Chapter 16, Stabilizing the Insanity. Roberto Bianchi looked up at the soldiers who had left him in the hole. They had just dropped him in the hole and had pulled out the rope, his only means of getting out. As he looked up, he heard the one soldier shout, "You better get to work, Bianchi. Get the surveying done, and our liege might even let you live to see the monument's construction." He pulled out the map the warlord had provided, and noticed a few places were marked on it. He then looked up at the soldiers who had left him in the hole with no way out. "You didn't honestly think we would leave the rope behind, Bianchi? You may have the blessing of our liege, but you are still his prisoner. We won't let you have a chance to escape. Now complete your task." He knew he had no choice in the matter, and headed down the tunnel with the torch they had given him in hand. He still wasn't sure how he was going to be able to carry everything, but that wasn't the first of things that had bothered him about what was going on. Not too long ago, he was a passenger on a caravan, and he was going in search for new building designs. The caravan he was part of had been attacked by soldiers, and some of the people were killed. He wasn't sure the soldiers had killed some of them, because they didn't even fight the soldiers. When they came to him and found out he was an architect, he had been pulled aside. The warlord, who had led the forces that captured the caravan, had plans to build a big monument, and he had been chosen to make sure the site was stable. That was his job. It wasn't something he wanted to do, but it meant that he would go free when he was done. He even thought that as he climbed up the ladder into a large room. It was a very nice and ancient room. The only other remarkable thing about it was that there was 2 slaves in the room. He walked over to them. "How's the surveying going?" He watched as the one slave nervously went over to the far wall, while the other one looked at him and said, "This area is well, but we are both concerned that the warlord won't let us go when it's done. We're also concerned about others who went farther in." He watched as the slave motioned to a ladder on the far side of the room. He quickly understood, realizing it was also the same path he had to take to get to the first survey site. He glanced back at his fellow slave. "I'll keep an eye out for them." He then climbed down the ladder and started to pass through the cave passage. As he walked, he heard movement in the cave and wondered if it was one of the slaves, or possibly one of the guards. He wasn't sure if any guards had come down, but there had to be some down here. They wouldn't leave all the slaves down here alone. He neared the sound and saw a figure moving. As he held his torch in the direction of the sound, he froze in fright. The figure was a walking corpse. He quickly backed away and realized that the section of the cave he was in was bigger than the area he had just come from, and the site he had to go to was behind the corpse. He had to get past the corpse. As it neared, he was afraid. He didn't know what the corpse would do to him. He also didn't want to find out, especially as the thing neared him. When the thing was near him, he quickly ran around it. As he ran, he glanced back to see the creature turning to pursue him. By the time it had, he had started climbing the ladder to the first place he had to survey. He was thankful that when he had gotten up there, some of the slaves had gotten past the creature. He then moved to the center of the room and looked over things. He could tell the room was structurally sound and would need little reinforcement. If that thing he saw was the only creature there, the monument the warlord wanted would be built. But before he could safely say that, he needed to check all the other sites. Of course, for him to do that, he needed some sort of weapon to protect himself. He was sure the torch wasn't going to be enough if there were more corpses moving about. He quickly looked around the room and was shocked at what he had seen. He walked over to one spot and found a safe, and a quiver full of crossbow bolts. He was surprised that the guards would leave weapons like these laying around, but the fear the slaves had kept them from using the items. He picked up the weapons, and then had an idea. He went back to the ladder he had entered the room in, and climbed back down it. He did this quietly, so he didn't attract the attention of the corpse. He was thankful that it wasn't facing the ladder. It allowed him to come up behind the corpse and behead it with the safe. It was not right for the dead to walk around. It didn't take long for him to dispatch the corpse, and was grateful when it was gone. He then returned up the ladder and looked at the slaves in the room. How many others went past this point? He watched as one of the slaves turned to him almost fearful and said, "A few, but shortly after they went down that way, there were many screams. We fear that some or all of them are dead." Roberto nodded in understanding, and then said, "Head back down the path I just came from. I've made sure the path is safe. I'll continue on and see if anyone else is alive." He then watched as the slaves slowly moved towards the ladder that led back to the entrance. He then turned and went to the far ladder and headed down. When he was down, he moved forward and was stunned at what he saw. Halfway down the tunnel was 3 gates, and the one in front of him blocked the path to the ladder. As he neared the gates, Roberto wondered how he was going to get past them. As he pondered the problem, he glanced to the side of the gate, noticing a small lever in the wall. He quickly pushed it down, hoping it opened the path ahead. He was disappointed when the gate on his right opened. He quickly recovered from that disappointment when a corpse started to rise and come towards him. However, unlike the corpse he had seen earlier, which looked like it had drowned, this one looked like it had been skinned. Almost without thought he attacked the corpse and quickly dismembered it, lopping off its head as well. When the thing collapsed, he glanced over to see another lever and pulled it. When he did that, the gate that had been on his left opened, releasing 2 more corpses. When he saw they were covered in rags, he had an idea. He held the torch in front of him and touched the 2 with a flame. He watched as the 2 creatures thrashed about and soon collapsed in a fiery heap. He stayed back until the flames died down, and then headed into the alcove. A quick look around the alcove told him nothing else was there, except another lever. He pulled it down and turned to see the last gate rising up. As it went up, he watched another corpse get up from the ground. This corpse looked almost skeletal. He approached it and quickly sliced off its head with his scythe, and then headed towards the ladder that was behind the gate. Roberto was thankful when he entered a room with fellow slaves in it. He glanced at his map again, realizing this was the next survey site. He saw two slaves walking around the room, both skittish but checking the walls. As he looked around, he saw two odd things in the room. The first was another quiver full of crossbow bolts, and the other was a crossbow to use them in. He picked them both up and then looked around the room. He could see that the room was stable, but the walls could use a little reinforcement. He quickly made notes of that and then looked at the two slaves. He motioned for them to come over. "I want you two to head back. I fear there are dangerous things in here." "We know. We heard the screams coming from the other ladder in this room. We fear that the other slaves might be in danger. I think that's why no guards came down here." He had been thinking about the lack of guards. Maybe the reason there were no guards there was the fact that those corpses were all over. He then heard the other slave say, "I say, we should take this moment to escape. I'd rather take my chances with those creatures than a return to slavery." He then watched that slave run towards the ladder he hadn't entered from, and quickly descend it. Before he could follow, he heard the first one say, "If any others are alive down there, send them back our way. I've heard strange sounds coming from down that path." He nodded, and then headed straight for the ladder. But something odd happened. Just as he was about to descend the ladder, the whole place transformed in front of his eyes, and he was in a surreal hall. Yvette Cale watched as Roberto Bianchi appeared in the surreal hall. This was the 5th time the book had pulled her into the surreal place, and she was starting to get used to it. Even all the screams coming from the souls in the floor didn't bother her. Of course, it was a little unnerving to be floating over the non-existent floor. She quickly placed her foot on the walkway that led to the book, right behind Roberto, and said, "This place does seem very scary, but it's safer than it seems." She watched as he spun around and leaned back to avoid the sword swing. She could tell he was shocked by her appearance, and then had an apologetic look on his face. "I didn't know the warlord had sent a woman down here." She quickly shook her head at his statement. "He didn't send me down here. In fact, you aren't even in the ancient temple anymore. Where you are is a surreal place." She watched as he looked around, studying the place, and then said, "How did I get here?" "A very dark magic, and it's all stems from that book ahead of us." She then pointed at the skeletal hand altar that held the tome of eternal darkness. "And the only way for you to leave here is by grabbing the tome." She glanced at him and noticed he was now looking at a map. "This place isn't on the map, so I know you are telling the truth. However, where are you from?" She thought about what he asked, and how to best explain it to him. It would be difficult to tell him that she was from centuries in the future. Finally, she figured out what she would say. "I'm from another time and place. The dark magic that is at work knows no limits. However, even though we are both victims of this magic, we can help each other stop it. She could see he was stunned by those words. How can I help stop it? I'm just supposed to survey the ruins. She smiled and pointed to the statue of Karim. Many centuries ago, that man entered the same ruins you're in. He went to a secret chamber and found an item that will help stop the darkness. Unfortunately, he was cursed to guard the item there. Yvette watched as Roberto looked at the statue. He then said, What will happen when I get the item? And how will I know I've even found it? She looked at him and said, You'll know. I also know about the creatures running around the place. We'll have to fight them. My husband was also affected by the dark magic, and at one point he will join you. He's even been in this place before. She then watched as he moved towards the book and said, If what you say is true, then the warlord who sent me in here won't be building his monument here. He wouldn't dare build when he finds out about them. She shook her head. If he is Pius Augustus, he would dare. Have you ever wondered why the warlord picked this location? She watched as he thought about it. She then said, If the warlord is pious, then he will build here. He is a servant of the dark forces, and we must use his own dark magic to stop him. She stopped talking when she realized how she sounded. He might think that she was a part of the darkness herself. She then watched as he looked at her. I'm not sure what to think, but if dark forces want this book, then maybe I can get it out of here. I won't show the warlord either, if you are afraid he is this evil being. However, his actions have pointed that he is evil. I'll keep whatever I find here hidden, including this book. She then watched as he grabbed the book and disappeared from the hall. She then watched as the world transformed to the room in the Roivas mansion. She then hoped all would be well for Roberto Bianchi. Roberto Bianchi blinked when he realized he was back in the room he did his last survey from. He was right near the ladder he had been about to climb down. He started to wonder if his actions had been part of a weird dream. But then he realized the book was in his hands. He shuddered at the oddness of it all, and then climbed down the ladder. When he reached the bottom of the ladder, he noticed a fellow slave cringing in fear. He faced the man and said, What's wrong? What has happened? He watched as the man just pointed down the hall and mumbled, Creatures! Screams! He turned in the direction the man pointed and listened. He could hear the sound of something walking towards them from down the curved hallway. He held up the crossbow and waited until he saw something come into view. He was stunned to see something that looked like a scorpion walk into view. However, he could tell it wasn't one of the desert creatures. It was too big to be that. He took aim and fired at the creature. Soon, he heard it squeal and watched as it collapsed. Roberto was thankful until he heard more of the creatures moving down the hall. He slowly moved forward, since something told him they were heading to where their fallen comrade had died. As they entered his view, he quickly aimed and fired at each one he saw. It took him a small amount of time to wipe out the creatures, And when he was done, he had reached the far end of the curved corridor and found a ladder there. He quickly climbed the ladder, hoping to get to the next site he had to survey. The more he progressed, the stranger things had gotten. He also hoped that the warlord would abandon the site. As he stood up, he realized that the room was filled with a blue mist. He then realized he wasn't alone in the room, but that he was in the company of a figure in what appeared to be a dark cloak. He held the safe ready as the thing approached him. As it neared, he felt like the room was going mad. He could even swear that blood had started to flow from the walls. The unnerving sight almost made him forget the figure until it opened its cloak. He could then see that the cloak was actually wings. He also noticed the scythe-like tail ready to strike him. He quickly backed away as the tail came down at him. He lucked out when it missed him and swung his safe. He was stunned when the blade bounced off the wing. He waited until the creature opened its wings again and swung the safe. He was glad when his luck allowed the blade to cut through the creature's neck, killing it. As the creature fell to the floor, he saw the blue mist disappear, and noticed the room must have been a library of sorts. As he looked around, he saw a scroll lying open on what looked like a table in the center of the room. He picked it up, amazed that he could even read it. From what he read, the scroll appeared to be a spell that could summon a corpse. He then jumped as the scroll glowed yellow and disappeared. He quickly looked around, trying to figure out what happened to the scroll, and then remembered what he learned in the surreal hall. He opened the tome and saw the spell had appeared in the book. The more I see, the more I am sure that the warlord shouldn't build here. I hope when I get out of here he listens to reason. He then started down the other ladder in the room. When he reached the bottom, he glanced down the curved hall and saw a huge creature leaving a dead body. He quickly ran over to the body and noticed it had been one of the slaves, and from what he could see, the man died a terrible, painful death at the claws of the creature. He felt a rage in him and focused on the creature. He quickly got up and ran after the creature and slashed at the creature's arm, cutting it right off. He continued his assault as the creature turned to face him. He could see the creature had what appeared to be 3 heads. He then lashed out at each head, and in the rage he felt, he dodged each attack with ease. Normally he was not a fast person, but his fury made him want to end this creature quickly. Soon he heard it roar a death cry, and it collapsed. With the creature out of the way, he took a moment to look around the curved hallway. He glanced back to where the creature had slain the man, and saw a quiver full of crossbow bolts on a block. He grabbed it and added the bolts to those he had already found. He then continued down the hall, hoping the next room would not have a creature like the one he destroyed in it. When he entered the room, Roberto was stunned to see a corpse moving towards a spot between the door he entered and a door on the opposite side of the wall. He was almost afraid the creature would attack him, but he watched as it sped up and walked right to the spot. His relief turned into horror as a section of the ceiling came down and crushed it, and then retracted. All that was left was a stain, and he heard a gate lower in front of a ladder down. Somehow, the deadly trap must have been a security measure. He then looked around the room and was thankful when he saw no other creatures in the room. There were more fallen slaves in the room, but he wondered if any had been lost in that trap. Other than the 3 exits and the trap, there was nothing more to the room. He felt he had to consult the map to figure out where he had to go. However, as he went to look at the map, he found it had disappeared. He wasn't sure why, but he felt the need to check the tome. He wasn't too surprised when he opened the evil book and found the map in the pages of the book. He then saw that the next survey site was down the ladder that the trap had closed off to him. He then had to figure out how to get the gate up. He didn't want to use one of the corpses of the slaves, but there were no walking corpses in the room. Almost instantly, he remembered the spell he had found. He turned the pages in the tome and read over the spell. Soon he cast it and saw the creature in front of him. He also saw a second image, as he realized he was seeing what the creature saw. Soon he made the creature make its way to the same area the first one walked to. He watched and saw as it entered the area. Soon the second vision ended, and he lost control of the creature as the trap crushed it. He also noticed that the trap didn't retract this time. He heard the gate rising up, and realized the way was now clear. He went to the ladder and climbed to the hall below. When he reached the bottom of the ladder, he realized he was in danger. The floor was covered with a red mist, and down the hall he saw another of the cloaked creatures. He saw it facing what appeared to be a man, but he was sure it was one of the walking corpses. He then saw the thing open its wings and strike the corpse down. As it did so, he saw 5 symbols appear on the ground, and another corpse came out of it. He then watched as the corpse started to head towards him, and the creature started to come towards him as well. He knew that he couldn't let the tail hit anything, and decided to attack the new corpse. However, before he attacked, he enchanted the safe. He had been lucky the last time, and he didn't want to chance being killed here. When he did enchant the safe, he wasn't sure which rune to use, so he decided to use the purple one. With the new enchanted weapon, he made short work of the corpse, and then glanced away from the corpse to see the cloaked creature ready to attack him. He knew he had only a few seconds before the tail came down at him. He aimed for the head, but was disappointed when he didn't cut this one's head off. However, he did notice the creature had stepped back and was glowing purple. He watched as the creature prepared to strike again, but staggered back again as the purple glow pulsed. He moved forward as the creature prepared to attack again and swung his safe as the purple glow pulsed again. He didn't decapitate the creature, but the 2 blows were enough to kill it, and it collapsed. He swung his safe into it after it collapsed and saw the red mist disappear. When he was sure it was safe, he continued to the end of the serpentine hallway. He reached an area with a strange altar in it. What made the altar strange was its resemblance to the hand-like structure that held the tome. He then glanced off to his left and was surprised at what he found. He double-checked what he saw with his map and smiled. That area was the next one he needed to survey. He started to walk over to the area and froze as the area suddenly got cold. He then saw a ghostly figure appear in front of him, as well as behind him. "Venture no farther. I am the guardian spirit of this temple." This worried him. Was the spirit like the other creatures that he had seen in the place? However, before he could even say a word, the spirit in front of him swung a huge sword. He felt it go through him, and at first he thought he was dead. But he glanced down to see that there was no damage. The sword had been as ghostly as its owner. He could then see the spirit was shocked. He then heard the spirit say, "You are the chosen one. For many years I've been testing those who have made it to this chamber. All have failed. You, however, are unaffected by my powers. You are the one meant to safely take the items I have stood guard over." Roberto was confused. He had come to this place to survey the area. "What do you mean by items?" He saw the spirit smile. "I was once confused like you. I'm sure you have already met the red-headed woman. I see that her husband is with you. In time he will come to your aid. Just whatever you do, do not take the one item without covering your hands. Its evil will corrupt you if you touch it." He then watched as the spirits disappeared and saw 2 items on the one podium. The first was a ruby statue, and from what he could tell, it was a kneeling warrior. He then glanced at the other item left behind, and he could feel the dark energy radiating from it. He reached down to the lower hem of his robes and ripped off a piece of fabric to carry the red, claw-like item. After he wrapped the item up in the cloth, he examined the room. It looked structurally sound, but he had found it odd that they had included this area on the map for surveying. If they had, they would have known about the spirits and the items. He then left the area and headed back to the room that had the crushing panel in it. As he walked, he consulted the map again, hoping that he didn't have many more sites to check out. He mentally noted that some of the sites on the map had been checked. That left 2 more, and they were both through the door on the left of the crusher trap. He just hoped that when he got to the room, the trap hadn't been activated again. Roberto was glad when he found the trap hadn't been activated again. He left the area of the ladder and headed to the door to the left of the crusher. He wasn't sure what he would find behind the door, so he decided to enchant his sword again. He then entered the room and saw 4 corpses covered in rags. He wasn't surprised when they all focused on him and started shuffling his way. His first instinct was to attack with the enchanted sword, but something told him to use the torch he had instead. He quickly touched it to the corpses and watched as they were quickly engulfed in flames. When the last corpse fell, he looked around the room he was now in. At the far end, at the far wall, was a large door. On the right-hand wall, close to the door, was another door. And close to him was a ladder down to another level. As he thought about where to go first, he knew that the ladder didn't lead to the 2 remaining survey sites, but he couldn't help but wonder what was down there. He could see the area on his map, which meant that he needed to get down there. Before he headed down the ladder, he took another look around the room and saw another quiver full of crossbow bolts. He had needed them before, when he saw those scorpion-like creatures. He added them to the supply he had, and then climbed down the ladder. When he reached the bottom, he stopped and listened. He heard what sounded like 2 of those creatures walking around. He held up the torch he had, and then realized that whenever he held it, it had lit up. He then saw the 2 creatures walk into view. He quickly aimed and fired the crossbow twice, and watched as the 2 creatures collapsed. He then started down the hall, and was about to turn to his right when he heard a tapping. He glanced back at one alcove, but saw nothing. He could have sworn he heard something metal tapping the ledge. He then continued down the hallway and entered a door. On the other side of the door he saw a large room, but he froze when he saw what was happening. 3 of the drowned-looking corpses were attacking a 3-headed creature that was red. His first instinct was to attack the creatures, but something told him to stay back. He stayed out of sight of the creatures and watched as those creatures fought. He was amazed as the fight progressed. While the 3-headed creature was larger and visually more powerful than the corpses, the creature fell to the 3 corpses. He watched as the corpses gathered around their fallen foe and chose to strike at that moment. He quickly ran over and swung his safe at each corpse. It was obvious the battle had taken a lot out of the corpses, as each one collapsed in one strike. When the last corpse had fallen, he looked around the room and saw a large altar in the room. On top of the altar was a key, and on the side of the altar was a blue symbol surrounded by a pentagon. The only other thing he noticed about the altar was it was surrounded by what looked like molten rock. He started to wonder how he was going to get it when he heard the tapping again. He could have sworn it came from in front of the altar. He then remembered one thing. He opened the tome, and almost as if he knew where it was, he had opened the book to the very page he was looking for. A spell to reveal things invisible. He read it over and started to cast it, using the ring that matched the patterns. He even used the green rune. Soon he saw a rock appear in front of the altar. He walked over to the altar and picked up the key. As he looked at it, he could have sworn it looked like it fit the big door he saw above. He then turned around and headed for the door out. However, as he passed the gate before the door, he froze. The door had disappeared, and he could have sworn he saw a woman sitting at some odd sort of table. Alexandra Roivas looked up for a moment and wondered where Yvette had disappeared to. She knew that she had returned from the past, but she had been engrossed in reading to notice where the redhead had gone off to. Her thoughts were quickly interrupted when she felt a familiar presence in the room. She turned to her left and saw the ghost of her grandfather standing there. She looked at him and said, "Grandfather, please help me. It's—" She was startled at how harsh he spoke. "Don't be a weak wretch of a girl. You're stronger than that." She was stunned at how he said it. It didn't seem like him. But if it was his ghost, it had to be him. She had never known about any of this. It was as if he had been hiding it from her. "You kept all this from me. You never shared any of this." She was suddenly scared when he stared at her with a look of contempt. "I could never burden you with this. I wanted you to leave me alone." His next words scared her most. "Why couldn't you have been killed with your parents?" Before she could respond, she saw a startled look cross the ghost's face. She then heard a voice say, "Get away from her." She then saw a book fly past her, and the ghost disappeared in a small orb of blue light. She turned to see Yvette was standing at the door. She watched the redhead walk over to her. "That wasn't your grandfather, Alexandra. It was another disguise of Pius. I think he knows we are getting close to stopping him. Plus, if you stop reading the book, my husband will be stuck in the past." She realized that Yvette was right. She turned back to the book and said, "You're right, Yvette. I'll get through the chapter, and then we will find the next chapter." She then returned to reading the chapter and felt better as Yvette rested a hand on her shoulder. She realized that while the woman that was Dr. Lindsay's daughter could see the truth, her presence was enough to calm her own sanity. Roberto blinked when the image disappeared. It was surreal. It couldn't have happened, but it looked like it had. First another room was in front of him, but now it was the door out of the room. He also noticed for the first time that everything seemed to have a green glow around it. He didn't remember seeing that in the image he had seen. Maybe he was losing his mind. He started to hope now more than ever that he would get done checking this place. He left the room and headed back towards the ladder up. As he walked past the alcove he had passed earlier, he stopped. There on the ledge was a statuette made of sapphire, and seemed to resemble something like a sorcerer. He was wondering if that was what the tapping earlier tried to bring to his attention. He picked up the statue and climbed back up the ladder. At the top of the ladder, he started to wonder how he managed to carry all the items he found. Was some sort of dark magic helping him carry the items? He didn't feel overburdened as he walked. He then entered the door that was next to the ladder. He was glad when he saw a few slaves working in the room. He started to walk down the hall to the large circular room with 3 slaves in it. As he walked, he could have sworn he heard a hiss of some sorts. He started to feel like something wasn't right. He stepped to the middle of the room and watched as the 3 slaves continued to look at the walls. He discreetly opened the tome and looked through it until he found one spell. It was a spell called Damage Field. That hiss he heard had put him on edge, and something told him an attack was coming. He was going to be ready for it now. He cast the spell, making sure it was 5 points, and with the purple rune. As the runes appeared on the ground, he heard each rune's name called out. The slaves, however, didn't notice it. Roberto then looked around the room again. He still felt like there was something in the room, but he was hopeful the circle of runes would protect him. He couldn't tell if the other slaves heard the sounds the runes made, but he heard the hiss rise in pitch. He waited a moment to see if anything tried to attack. When nothing did, he decided to check the room out. He stayed within the circle of runes, but looked around the room. He could see that some of the walls would need reinforcement, but if there were still creatures down here, it would be pointless to do so. He was finishing scanning over the ceiling when the hisses got louder. He stopped looking at the walls just in time to see one of the slaves coming right at him. Just from the look he could see in the man's eyes, he could tell the man meant to harm him. He almost started to back up, but didn't when the man walked into a purple glow and staggered back. The spell he had cast had obviously protected him. He then watched as the slave was now glowing purple, as well, as if his body was enchanted. He then heard the other 2 slaves in the room run into the barrier he put up. He couldn't figure out why they were doing this, unless something was controlling them. He finally got the answer to why it was happening, but he was scared by it. The slave that was in front of him exploded, revealing a skinny creature with blades for arms inside. He then heard the other 2 explode in the same way. The only thing that kept him from getting covered in gore was the barriers he set up. He then backed up a step as the one in front of him jumped at him. He hoped the barrier wouldn't fail, and was thankful when the creature fell back, now glowing purple. He heard the others 2 lunge at him as well, and heard both of them connect with the barrier. He quickly turned to look at the other 2 creatures, and then saw a man in very strange clothing running towards him. He could see that the 2 creatures hadn't seen the newcomer, but he heard the one now behind him start to move. That one wasn't trying to attack him anymore. He figured the creature was now going to take on the newcomer. He wanted to warn the man, but he wasn't sure if he should. was then thankful when the man pulled out a sword and swung it at the one creature, killing it. It was then that the other creature had joined the first one in spotting the newcomer. However, just as the second turned, he heard the first one scream and collapse. Apparently, the blue glow had killed the creature, and the newcomer finished off the remaining creature. He then watched as the man looked at him and said, "It's all clear, Roberto. All the bone thieves are dead. You can leave that barrier area now." He was stunned by what the man said, but then remembered what the others had said. The man was the one who was going to help him. Richard Cale waited until Roberto Bianchi finally stepped out of the barrier. He could tell Roberto was still a bit unsure. He then watched as the man looked at him and said, "You are the one the woman mentioned, as well as the spirits. You're here to help me." He nodded and then said, "Yes, you've been doing well so far. I'm just glad you haven't run into pies yet." He then noticed what the man was carrying. "I see you found the tome, as well as the essence of Jaturga, and the statue I pointed out to you." He watched as the man smiled and said, "Yes, I figured you were trying to help me. I had just got done surveying this room and have one place left to go. I think your sword will be able to help in getting there." Richard nodded. "Indeed, I think that would be wise. Last time I was here, I don't remember seeing that large door in the last room." That was true. Something about the size of the door told him something big and important was behind it. He wondered if it was like the chamber in the cathedral, where Paul Luther had been killed by the monster there. He then said to Roberto, "I will make sure you are safe. I've seen too many people lose their lives during this." He then watched as Roberto opened the door and headed into the next room and to the giant door. "I believe you. So many slaves have died down here. I was ordered to survey 5 locations here, and this will be the last one. Once I'm done, I will tell the warlord he can't build here." He then watched as Roberto held out a key. "I found this down the ladder. I'm sure this will unlock this door if the door is locked." He nodded and watched Roberto put the key in the lock. He heard the door unlock and followed Roberto into the room. He realized they were in a long hall, one that had a turn in it. When they reached the turn, he heard Roberto gasp, and he saw why. The longest stretch of the hallway was covered with yellow energy. At points along the hall, he saw dead bodies. He then looked at Roberto, who looked scared. He knelt down to the floor and said, "I've never seen anything like this, except in the lightning strikes the 3-headed horrors use. If we try to cross this as is, we will be hurt, even killed." He then got up and looked at Roberto. He watched as Roberto looked at the tome, which was turned to a map page. "We need to find some way across. There has to be some way to shield us from the energy." Richard smiled when he heard the words. "That's it. May I look at the tome for a moment?" He was glad when Roberto handed him the book. He quickly turned the pages and found the spell he was looking for. He then cast the shield spell and watched as 5 purple orbs surrounded him. He handed the book back to Roberto and said, "Cast that spell now, and then follow me." He watched as Roberto did cast the same spell, and then he ran into the light, into the energy field. As he ran, he saw the orbs occasionally leave, usually after a yellow lightning strike. By the time he was at the end of the hallway, all the orbs were gone, and Roberto was at his side. They headed into the door, catching their breath. When they were in the door, he was about to congratulate Roberto, but stopped when a large gate came down, blocking the only way out of the room. He forgot about congratulating Roberto and started to wonder how they were to get out. He glanced off to the right and saw a chasm. He didn't want to venture that way, but then saw Roberto heading towards the left of the gate. It was then he noticed the large room. He could see what looked like a bridge on a rope hanging from the ceiling. He also saw a large pit in the middle of the room. As he looked at the pit, he wondered if another creature lurked in this pit, like the creature that killed Paul Luthor. He then noticed that Roberto was standing by a slave. He saw the man had been shaken up, especially as Roberto said, "I can't believe he made it. He must have been the only one. He's been really shaken up. He keeps mentioning snakes. I haven't seen a single snake since I've entered here." He then looked over at the pit, wondering if the snakes had come out of the pit. However, he did notice a rope which led to the bridge. He then said, "I don't know what he means, Roberto, but something tells me we will have to get to the other side of the pit." He then cut the rope and watched as the bridge crashed down and into place across the bridge. He then started to cross the bridge. As he walked across, he said, "Roberto, you might want to check the place from the center of the bridge. It's the best place." He stopped speaking when he saw large purple worms shoot out from the pit. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. They looked familiar, but just as they all looked at him, it happened. He felt disoriented. It was a blink coming on. That wasn't a good thing, with these things attacking. As the disorientation started to subside, he noticed that one worm fell and then another worm fell. He then noticed that the last worm had a crossbow bolt in it. He started to stagger, but was surprised when someone steadied him. He realized it was Roberto, as the man said, "Are you all right?" He nodded and then said, "I'm fine. Just remind me which artifact you had found." He watched as Roberto nodded and said, "It was essence of Ulyath. I can't forget it with how it feels, like it's emanating darkness. Now, you say I should survey from here?" He nodded. "Yes. You check things out, and then cast another shield spell. I'll do so after I pull that lever over there." He then saw Roberto start to look around, and he went over to the bridge. While Roberto was surveying, he thought about the worms that had attacked. He knew he had seen them before, and realized where. They were part of Mantarok. He was sure about that. When he was at the lever, he started to hope he was wrong. He pulled the lever and then headed back, seeing that Roberto was done and had cast the spell. He then took the book and cast the shield spell. When he was done, he returned the book to Roberto and they headed out. As they headed back, he heard Roberto ask, "Tell me, stranger, all this time you never told me your name." Richard smiled as they continued. "My name is Richard Cale. The dark magic of the book brought me here from the future. It's done this to me many times. This is not my first visit to this location." As they continued, he heard Roberto say, "Then you know about the evil in this place. You could tell the warlord not to build here. I'm sure he'll listen if two people tell him." Richard thought about it and then shook his head. "I doubt it. I wouldn't be surprised if the warlord would be eager to see me. If my thinking is right, the warlord is Pius Augustus. If that's the case, we are both dead if he gets us." He suppressed a shudder when he said that. It wasn't the full truth, but he knew Pius was waiting for the right moment to get him. He also knew that this wasn't the time for him to fall, since when he was in Lindsay's time, Pius had remarked that he had escaped many times before. He then heard voices coming from up ahead. He glanced over at Roberto, who confirmed something he had feared. "It's the warlord. He must have come down to hear my report. I'm sure he can't be this Pius Augustus. I might even show him the statues I found down here." He then watched as Roberto felt around his robes, and then looked at him. "They're gone. The safe, the crossbow, the book, everything is gone." He stopped and looked at Roberto. "Maybe it's to protect the items. Maybe you need to pass them on to the right person. I'm sure you'll know who when you see them. I might even be with them." He then watched Roberto nod and heard him say, "Then wish me luck." He then watched as Roberto climbed up the ladder. He stepped over to the base of the ladder, hoping to hear what was happening up there. He heard Roberto mention about the creatures and wasn't surprised when he heard a harsh voice say, "Those creatures are the reason this place was built in the first place. The monument will continue as planned. In fact, architect, you shall serve a very special place in it, as well as the person you were talking with. Guards, take him for the pillar." Richard started to back away from the ladder as he realized that the warlord was approaching the top of the ladder. "I don't know how you keep appearing, but you won't escape this time." He then noticed that the figure had started to descend the ladder. He started to continue back the way he had come, and just then the world started to change around him. The chapter was over. He wasn't sure what had happened to Roberto, but he was sure that Roberto was about to die. However, just as he was sure that he was back in the present in the Roivas estate, he realized that the room wasn't the one in the Roivas mansion. He wasn't even sure where he was now, and it scared him.